Thanks, Kyle. Merci, Marie. As Kyle mentioned, I spent 32 years in intelligence here in Canada with CSIS and with the Communications Security Establishment. Now, while transnational repression and foreign interference is not something that I worked on, it was more counterterrorism, I'm well aware of the investigations that my former colleagues with those organizations are involved with to uncover the nature of TNR in Canada, the extent of it, the actors that are involved. And I think it's important to remember that when we think of TNR, we think of some, as Marie mentioned, some traditional actors, like the Chinese and like the Russians. When Marie and I were doing the research for our paper, we found out that it goes well beyond that. There is Algerian transnational repression here in Canada, whereby there are people from the Algerian diaspora, part of the Kabylie community, that are seeking some sort of independence or some kind of autonomy within Algeria, who are being pressured by the Algerian government not to say anything about it. And as we're speaking here in February of 2026, you've all been watching what's happening in Iran with the mass riots and the attempts to overthrow the regime. I have spoken to Iranian Canadians who regularly receive threats to not raise what's happening in Iran here in Canada, to not protest against the regime. And I think Marie did a great job of outlining the types of threats that these people face. Everything from online harassment, women are receiving sexual threats. And let's bear in mind that we've had assassination plots, one of which was successful here in Canada, out in British Columbia a couple of years ago, of a Sikh activist by agents of the Indian government. I have a former colleague, a very senior Saudi intelligence official I met many years ago, and a Saudi hit squad was sent to Canada in the late 2010s to assassinate him as well for things he was saying against the Saudi regime. Therefore, it's really important that, and as Maria and I write in the report, TNR is a widespread phenomenon, as Kyle has mentioned, through G7 leadership under Canada has pointed that out. Let's not narrow our focus on one or two nations. It goes right across the border. The next part, I guess, is what are we going to do about it? And as somebody who worked in intelligence, my simple recommendation is that we've got organizations that are looking into these threats. My former colleagues at CSIS look under transnational repression under Section 2B of the CSIS Act. So TNR is a subset of foreign interference. They're collecting intelligence, they're corroborating the intelligence, they are providing intelligence to decision makers, and I think it's incumbent on the government to take that intelligence seriously. The Hogan inquiry pointed out quite starkly that a lot of intelligence on Chinese interference in our elections and through TNR was ignored for reasons I won't get into. So it's important that if we're going to deal with TNR, and as Kyle and Marie mentioned, this is a very sort of broadband approach to what to do about TNR. But at a minimum, the government has to remain informed on who the actors are, where they are, and what they're doing. Marie mentioned police stations. People think, well, the police stations, that's yesterday's news. No, it's not yesterday's news because they're still here. And so we have the intelligence services, we have the RCMP that investigates under their own legislative mandate. So let's take the information that's being gathered by the professionals. Let's ensure that it's being read, that it's being consumed, so that the actions that Canada and, in sharing with our G7 partners as well, can be as best informed as possible, so that the policies and actions that we can take are based on the best information and therefore the greatest possibility of success in preventing. You'll never eliminate TNR. You can certainly get to a point where you can minimize the effect of it, because as Marie said, diasporas are suffering. And we are a nation of diasporas. And we want to make sure that those diasporas feel that they can function, they can vote freely, they can voice their opinions freely, they can express their own views on their regimes back home without fear of any kind of violence to them or to their families. So the information's there. Let's do our best to use it. Thank you.
And in closing, I just want to emphasize that that this transnational repression, it's not going away. We have our esteemed colleague, the Honourable Irwin Cotler, former Attorney General of Canada Minister, who's still under 24-hour police protection since a couple of years now from threats from the Iranian regime. So even Canadians of high political status are susceptible of violence from foreign regimes operating in our democracy. So we must combine our capacity to do more with civil society, to expose some of these works, and to protect diaspora groups. One last point, the report can be seen in full on the website of our institute, www.migsinstitute.org, and we remain open to answer any questions if there are from people following online or in the audience. Thank you very much.
You sorry, Elizabeth Thompson, CBC News. You mentioned the question of the opening up between Canada and China and more travel and that. What are you specifically concerned about, and what should the government be doing to ensure that the people who come to Canada as tourists or as under whatever category aren't in fact people who are going to engage in transnational repression?
I'm sure my colleagues will have questions, or they have their own ideas on this. I would point and put forward is that as we undergo Canada this geopolitical shift, an unreliable U.S. ally that's threatening Canada economically and also our sovereignty, is that we also cannot be naive in dealing with the government of China. The China has weaponized trade, it's thrown Canadians in jail, and we should not for a moment think that Canadian citizens traveling to China are not under threat of being monitored. We've had talks with Tibetan community who are always asked to spy on their fellow Tibetan community members here in Canada whenever they go to the Chinese embassy to get a visa. We're assuming that is continuing. But also there are many people entering the country who are not really international students or temporary workers that are engaging in transnational repression. So we have to keep our eyes open, and we can't close our eyes to the authoritarian threat that China represents and still is. As many countries around the world that deal with transnational repression will tell you that China is one of the biggest players, if not the biggest player. So that would be my comment. I don't know if Marie or Phil, if you have some comments?
Yeah, sure. I would simply state that within CSIS, there's the Security Screening Branch, which is the largest operational branch that CSIS has. And security screening is done on a variety of files, citizenship files, certain immigration files. CSIS has the resources, or it could always use more, but it has the mandate to do those types of things. So if there are visitors coming from the People's Republic of China, they should be vetted through CSIS. That has its own intelligence sources, has alliances with its counterparts around the world. And if CSIS comes up against information that indicates somebody is not being truthful or forthcoming in their background or their intentions on coming to Canada, they should be denied entry. I mean, there's no right to come to Canada. It is a privilege. And organizations like CSIS have the mandate to do the background checks on people to make sure they're not entering for purposes that are not consistent with what they claim. So a very simple answer to your question, ma'am, is that listen to what CSIS says when it says that somebody has a background that would make them ineligible to come to Canada.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think keeping the foreign agent registry will be important. That's something we have seen in other countries that I think can be quite effective. But it's not just China. There is also one case you mentioned in the report, which is Rwanda, which is often underlooked as a case because that happens through the physical stress from that, and the physical intimidation from Rwanda has been quite important as well. And that's often not a case that a lot of people look at.
This is a subject that has been looked at a lot in the past year or two. There's been a whole federal inquiry, and that what does your report bring to this debate that we don't already know, and why now? Just as the government has actually named a foreign influence commissioner and is getting the registry up and running, or at least has, published draft regulations.
Sure, I'll give some questions and I'll turn to my colleagues. So I think why this report is being done now is that it's partly because of the geopolitical situation that we're seeing. We're seeing countries, and it's not just Canada, looking to sign partnerships with China and others, which we want to highlight that poses some risk, not on the economic side, but on the national security and human rights side. So that's part of why this report's coming out now. Two, Canada just handed over the G7 to France. So there's an opportunity to build on Canada's leadership that it held at the G7 on transnational repression, both online and offline. So those are I think, are two key things that I would say. On the Hogue Commission looked particularly at electoral interference. It didn't look at transnational repression. But one of the main comments made by diaspora groups was that this doesn't just happen. The foreign interference doesn't just happen during elections or during the election cycle. It's happening to many other communities, and transnational repression was one of the points or the components that Justice Hogue said shocked her and realized that more has to be done and more has to be studied. So we thought it was important to put this out there right now to highlight that diaspora groups in Canada, as well as others that support these diaspora groups, are being targeted. And it's probably actually going to accelerate because of the U.S. Government that's cut all the funding to the key organizations that have studied and tracked this online and offline and shared it both through the Five Eyes and also with civil society partners. So there's a situation of opportunity for us to not let this fade, but to move it higher up the agenda.
I think it's important to underscore that this report began in 2024. The fact we're launching it today is for reasons that were beyond our control in many ways. I don't want to get into the details, it's not important. It's the only report that I'm aware of that gives a lot of actual details about TNR in Canada specifically. Been lots of reports on TNR as a phenomenon worldwide. And when you read the report, which is not very long, you'll get into actual concrete cases of individuals in Canada. In fact, one of our colleagues was going to join us today, but he wasn't able to make it. People who live here who actually have experienced, they themselves, their families, have been threatened by transnational actors outside of Canada. So that, I think in that case, it's important to summarize that. And secondly, I think, in the final section of the report, we have some concrete recommendations on things that can be done. This is not a theoretical piece. This is a very concrete piece on what is happening, who's doing it, how it's happening, the impact, as Marie said, on diasporas, and most importantly, what do we need to do about it as Canadians? As I said earlier, we're very proud that we're a diaspora country. We're a multicultural country, but we have to protect the most vulnerable people in our country that are being subjected to these actions by people in their former regimes. They come to Canada for a safe life. They come here with their families to escape repression, to escape death in some cases, and yet they're faced with those same threats when they come here. So I think it's incumbent on us as a Canadian government and as Canadian citizens to identify this to the best of our abilities and to therefore put forward, this is what we know, let's take action to stop it.
Is Mr. Toty not here today because he felt that there was a threat?
No, he
Suggesting that one of your colleagues would be here in the context.
We're not
of
actually
threatening.
aware why Mr. Toty wasn't able to, whether there was a conflict in the schedule, we're not sure, but we have nothing to suggest that he was under any, fear of appearing today.
I know he has been followed in the past.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, I think the other thing about the report is that a lot of the countries that were mentioned in the media, in other reports, were very much about China, Russia, India, but we also mentioned Rwanda, Algeria. We could have gone into looking at Ethiopia as well, and smaller countries that are often overlooked. So this is a really a global phenomenon, and we should also be aware, dig more into what's happening on university campuses, because we know it's happening, transnational repression is happening there as well. So there are a lot more to look into, and that's what we're doing at the moment as well. We're digging more into this. So I think, it's continue the research, continue helping the victims, because they want to be heard as well. For years, they were completely not listened to. And finally, they got a bit of a chance to do so at the commission, but a lot more victims were not present at that commission and were not able to speak. So it's important to hear from them as well, and to continue to, bring their experiences forward.